LSAT blog. I also host the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. I've been teaching the LSAT since 2005, and I've never seen so many changes in such a short time. It's really been remarkable, first with the LSAT going digital last year, and now the unexpected move to online due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We have the LSAT being administered online from home using a software called ProctorU. It's called the LSAT Flex. And so part of my role in navigating students through these changes, is, as I see it, is to help you figure out what remains relevant from the past and also what you have to modify going forward. And so I can understand the uncertainty around not knowing which format you would get or how to prep appropriately. And so I want to assure you that whatever happens, your previous materials are still relevant. The previous exams are still relevant. The study techniques are still relevant. The content is still relevant. And so I think the first step is to recognize that some things will change, but some things won't change. And so if you don't know which format you're going to get, focus on what doesn't change. And then as the test gets closer, maybe you'll have more information, and maybe you will be able to prep more appropriately for one format versus the other. So I wanted to start with just addressing the most common questions I've been getting from students regarding the LSAT Flex, what it is, how it went, because we already had one administration of the Flex last week for the May LSAT. We're also going to have one in a couple weeks for the June LSAT, and then July and August are open questions, although I think that at least the July LSAT is pretty likely to be a Flex. That has not been decided yet. I also want to share in the chat, if I'm able to here, just a link to my most popular playlist at the moment on the YouTube channel. It's bit.ly/LSAT Flex. I have a playlist focused specifically on LSAT Flex preparation as we've been learning of all the changes, the latest updates from LSAC over the past couple of months. And so even if you don't know anybody else in your personal life, or you can't meet anybody in person to study for the LSAT because of the situation, you can still learn a lot through sessions like this, as well as through the YouTube videos and the podcast, where I'm releasing frequent updates, sometimes multiple times a day, as we learn more about upcoming test dates and different features of the LSAT Flex, both what has happened and what we expect to happen going forward. But again, remember that the content of the exam is the same, just the testing environment has changed. And so now we get into a little bit of test taking strategies. How do you prepare for a 3-section online exam versus a 5-section in-person exam? So first we had paper LSAT, 5 sections. It's still paper outside North America, but within North America, it was changed to be digital on a tablet, specifically a Microsoft Surface Go tablet, but it was still 5 sections, same test length as previous. Now with the Flex, it's 3 sections. It's condensed. You have 1 section of games, 1 section of logical reasoning, and 1 section of reading comprehension. So rather than 2 scored logical reasoning sections, it's only 1 scored section of logical reasoning. But logical reasoning is still the same content. Games, still the same content. Reading comp, still the same content. And this is not the first change we've seen with the LSAT, even with the format. Back in June 2007, they switched from having 4 long passages to 3 long passages and then 1 set of short or dual comparative passages. They also had a change where they added rule substitution questions in 2009 to the logic game section, and that has appeared on nearly every exam since. So changes to the exam are not unprecedented, and law schools don't care whether you did the Flex or the regular 5 section. They don't care if you do digital or paper. They don't care if you did any other change along the way. Regardless, they consider your LSAT score valid. LSAC still gives you a score out of 180 on that 120 to 180 band. So I wouldn't worry about which one you take. As for which is harder, which is easier, it's really a wash. There are pros and cons to each that we could get into if you all would like me to, but overall, it's the same content of the exam. Harder in that maybe each question's worth more, so there might be stress associated with that, but easier in that 3 sections, you're done in 2 hours. So I think overall, assuming a good internet connection and a good device, a 3-section online exam from home is preferable to a 5-section in-person exam, but one may play more to your strengths than others. So just some things to keep in mind there. Overall, I'd say focus on the core content for now, deal with the format later. Now, as for my personal LSAT journey, like I said, I started teaching this exam in 2005. That's back when I took the exam. And I never thought I'd be doing this because when I first opened a practice test, I bombed it, at least in my eyes. I got a score in the low 150s. And that's obviously a great score for many people. It's right around the average, but I went to an Ivy League undergrad. I thought I was going to go to a top 14 law school, and you can't get into a top 14 law school with a score in the low 150s. Definitely if your GPA is only 3.3, which is around what mine was. So I was in for a rude awakening taking that diagnostic, which is part of why I actually don't recommend cold diagnostics, because they often don't go well. Instead, I say, learn the foundation, then take exams. And what I did was I just skipped straight away to taking exams. I took exam after exam after exam. I measured myself. I tracked my scores obsessively with spreadsheets, and my scores did not go up. They would not budge. They stayed in the low 150s for several months. And that's because I had fallen prey to what I now call the obsessive practice exam narrative. The idea that taking exam after exam will give you some key insight that unlocks everything for you. When in reality, you've got to learn the basics of each section first and not go straight to doing timed exams, but instead start with untimed work to slowly learn the material. So I now recommend what I call the obsessive practice exam narrative. This is the idea. So that's what students fall into. But what I recommend now is what I call the LASER approach to LSAT studying. LASER is an acronym standing for learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. So learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. Learning is the theory, basically reading textbook chapters, watching videos, getting a general sense of what each section of the exam involves, what each question type involves. Then A is for accuracy, doing individual questions by type to better understand the proper perspective from which to view each question type. So that would be ordering games, or strengthening questions in logical reasoning, or flaw questions, necessary assumption, and then how to approach a reading comp passage. Then S is for sections, doing timed 35-minute sections to work on your pacing. Then you have E for endurance, which is doing full-length 5-section exams for the in-person LSAT, or 3 sections for the LSAT Flex. And then R is for review, which is too often neglected, but is actually incredibly important. And so I would say when it comes to the review process, I'll go more in depth on that now. Basically, I recommend what I call the Socratic review method. And the Socratic review method is basically an inquiry. Basically, you analyze your mistakes. You analyze your thought process for any question that gave you trouble, or you got wrong or gave you difficulty. So one example might be in logical reasoning. If you got a logical reasoning question wrong, where did your misunderstanding stem from? Was it in the stimulus? Was it in the question stem? Or was it in the answer choices? If it was in the stimulus, what about the stimulus tripped you up? Was it a complex argument? Did they bury the conclusion in the middle? Did they fail to use indicator words? Or did they use annoying indicator words like unless, except, until, or without, all of which require some degree of translation? Did you have to take the contrapositive? Was it on a tough topic? There's a million different reasons why it could have been difficult for you, but you've got to figure out specifically what made it difficult for you and what tricks you don't fall for, so you can avoid falling for those tricks or traps going forward. If your misunderstanding was in the question stem, what about the question stem was difficult? Maybe they used unfamiliar wording, or maybe you couldn't tell the difference between 2 different types. Like a common area is necessary assumption versus sufficient assumption. The difference between them actually matters a lot, but students often confuse one for the other. Or alternatively, if your mistake was in the answer choices, what was tempting about the wrong answer that made you pick it, and what ultimately makes it wrong? And what was discouraging about the right answer that pushed you away from it or made it seem unappealing, and what ultimately makes it correct in the end? So you see, this is a process. There's stimulus, question stem, and choices. And then within each of those categories, there are different things to be looking for that could have given you trouble, different areas you could have gotten tripped up. And maybe you got tripped up in multiple areas, but there's also tricks that you didn't fall for. And you've got to figure out which ones you do fall for and really hone in on those so you can avoid making the same mistakes going forward. Because this exam does repeat itself, and you're not just looking to measure yourself like I did. You're actually looking to see where your mistakes are coming from so you can avoid making them going forward. And that means you actually want to get questions wrong. You want to do difficult problems that you have a low likelihood of success on so that you can learn and have that opportunity to review and avoid making the same mistake going forward. And this is too often neglected. Students will do it exam after exam after exam. The exams are all numbered. So you could say we're at exam 89 now, and there's a handful that are unnumbered, and just work through them one by one. I'd rather you do only 10 exams ever, but review them in excruciating detail. And so if your exam is, let's say you're taking the June LSAT Flex in a couple weeks, you might do 2 or 3 timed exams per week and a detailed review of those exams, and that could be it. That could be enough. You could do 2 exams next week, 2 exams the following week, 3 hours reviewing each one. Students might spend 30 minutes reviewing an exam, but 3 hours is more on the order of magnitude of what you actually need to do. And if you're following this Socratic review method that I laid out, it will take that long or even longer, and that's okay. That's really a good thing. It's better to do fewer questions in more depth. And so my rule for this overall, my practice test rule is maximum 3 exams per week, minimum 3 hours reviewing each exam. And that max of 3 exams per week, that would be more for if you're doing the LSAT Flex, which are shorter exams, or if you have no other obligations, like you're not working, you're not in school, which is of course maybe more likely over the summer, you could do 3 a week plus reviewing each one. If you are working or you have an internship or you are taking classes, maybe you'll do 2 exams per week and review those. If you want to do more, maybe you'll drill weak areas, maybe you'll do timed sections here or there, maybe you will look up resources covering the basics of a certain type that gives you trouble, but that's really more than enough. You don't need to do anything beyond that. That's really it, especially if you're taking the exam soon. If your timeline is longer, like you're aiming for the August LSAT or October or November or beyond, then you're going to spend more time in the earlier phases of that laser approach. You'll spend more time on learning the theory or doing individual questions by type. You'll save the timed exams for later. Let's see what else here. What else should I cover? I could cover a couple of specific rules or guidelines for different sections of the exam, specifically games, reasoning, and reading comp. So games, we all know, if you've taken a look at the exam up to this point, there's logic games, logical reasoning, reading comprehension. Within games, you have ordering, grouping, combinations, and my study plans cover the basics of each of those. And there's plenty of resources out there on those as well. But students run into trouble with weird curveball games and rule substitution questions. So I actually have lists of those here because most categorizations don't cover those. So I'm going to suggest that anyone who's already gotten a good sense of the basics should cover more of those weird curveball games and those rule substitution questions because they appear less frequently, but you can master them just the same. With regard to logical reasoning, too many resources focus only on question stem type. Like I said, necessary assumption, sufficient assumption, strengthen, weaken, flaw, must be true, and so on. But there's also the stimulus to focus on as well, not just question stem type. And the stimulus involves understanding fully the method of reasoning. How did they go about making their argument? What are the underlying assumptions? What did they fail to consider? And there aren't really a whole lot of categorizations of this sort because there are too many methods of reasoning out there, or any simple categories would be overly simplistic as to not be useful, like causal reasoning versus conditional reasoning in an argument. It's worth looking at, but that's not enough specificity. We need to think about correlational arguments or arguments based upon a study or a survey. And you could go deep down a rabbit hole analyzing those if you wanted to categorize them. So I wouldn't actually categorize them that way, but I would look with that perspective when you got a question wrong. Maybe you have trouble with arguments involving studies or surveys, and so you have to look and see, are they failing to use a representative sample? Is the sample size not large enough? Were the survey questions biased? Or for an argument involving correlations, maybe there's a third variable in play that could have caused both, or maybe the correlational nature is reversed. The causal relationship is reversed there. And so those are the kinds of things to be thinking about as you analyze questions and see what mistakes you're commonly making, what traps you're falling into. Then finally, for reading comprehension, one thing I'll say a common mistake students make is they take too many notes. They take too many notes, they highlight too much, they underline too much, and that was simply time consuming for the paper LSAT. For the digital or for the online LSAT Flex, the tools don't actually even work that well. They aren't that precise when you want to click or drag over a certain area to highlight or underline. So for that reason, as well as the time involved, I would aim to not annotate at all on the digital LSAT or the LSAT Flex. And I would take very few notes, if any, on the scratch paper, simply aiming to walk away with the main idea. So I know I've covered a lot here. That's in general what I had prepared, but I'm happy to entertain any questions at all that anyone has.
Well, thank you so much, first of all, Steve, for not only being here, but for providing us with all of that information. That was great, and I'm sure that was incredibly useful to so many of us who are working towards taking the LSAT. So now we have a question from Anushka on tips to increase your speed during the LSAT. Anushka, if you'd like to go ahead and unmute yourself to ask your question.
Hi, my name is Anushka. I'm trying to take the LSAT in the fall, and I've just noticed that like with a lot of the questions and a lot of the sections, the main part that I struggle with is to complete the questions within the time limit. So I was wondering like, what are the best tips that you have for like increasing your speed?
Yeah, sure. Any particular section?
Probably the logic games.
Yeah, sure. I definitely have some thoughts on that. First of all, increasing speed in general on the LSAT, you get faster by understanding more deeply. And so doing more questions of a given type will inevitably increase your level of familiarity, because the LSAT, all sections, is an exam of pattern recognition. So when you see a new question, you can put it into your mental framework or bucket of questions you've done of that type in the past. But that's not really an answer, obviously. So I'll give you a more detailed answer involving strategy, which is reuse previous work. So in logic games in particular, you have your orientation question that gives you a valid scenario, the answer there. Then you have any local or hypothetical scenarios you've drawn over the course of that game. If you look back at those, considering that they're valid scenarios that comply with all the rules, then you could use those to help you solve more general global questions later in the game. So when you're coming across a general global question in the moment, if you have no idea what the answer is, you could draw a bunch of hypotheticals in that moment, or you could simply brute force it by running through all 5 choices. But that takes quite a while. Instead, I would say, skip that question, flag it, do the local if questions, and use those later to help you solve the general global questions. It's probably the biggest thing I would say for increasing speed, other than making more initial inferences up front whenever possible.
Thank you so much, Steve, for answering Anushka's question. Now we have a question from Ariel Yomtov on the importance of conditional reasoning. Ariel, if you'd like to unmute yourself, please feel free to do so and ask your question.
Hey, Steve. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Ariel. I recently just started watching your videos as I started studying for the LSAT, so super excited to have you here. I had a few questions. So the issue I find myself having is that a lot of my friends, they start studying, they memorize where it says, okay, if you have an if, then that's an indicator of a conditional statement and such. But as I'm reading through these questions, I'm more so just focused on the content and kind of understanding the content and not really identifying what's the premise, where's the conclusion. I'm still getting those answers right. So I wanted to ask you pretty much is, how does one go about effectively identifying a conditional statement or different type of questions without having to memorize these key words, if, then, since, and all these different things? Because I feel like there's so many different indicators and one can get lost.
That's a great question. Thanks for that. So there are a lot of indicators out there, and I wouldn't necessarily aim to memorize them with flashcards. If that's what it takes, though, I would do it, because it is incredibly important to recognize what's a sufficient indicator, what's a necessary indicator. It's important to know those on the LSAT, especially so for games involving conditional rules, but also in logical reasoning to a lesser extent. But your point is a valid one, and I agree with you, actually, that certain resources overemphasize the importance of diagramming or of thinking of things in a conditional way on the logical reasoning section. Most logical reasoning arguments are informal in nature, meaning that diagramming isn't going to do a whole lot for you, and most of them don't even involve multiple conditionals. So the cases where diagramming is useful is when you see multiple conditional statements that can be linked together. And another indicator of diagramming being useful is when they're not talking in a way that anybody would talk in everyday life. So if you have lots of very formal conditional statements that are leading to something that are linking together in some way, then you may want a diagram. But for most question types, diagramming is not going to help you. And the thing you mentioned about engaging in a real world sense is what I recommend as well. So for example, necessary assumption questions are always informal. I would never diagram those. You diagram sometimes on must be trues, sometimes sufficient assumption questions, sometimes parallel questions, but most logical reasoning question types, conditionality and formal logic doesn't really come into play. So I think too many students overemphasize diagramming and they try to treat it as a crutch, when in reality, all you're doing is turning the variables or the proper nouns in the stimulus into letters, but it's not actually getting you anywhere further.
Got it. So would you say you recommend memorizing those if, since, then, and kind of having those as indicators, but not actually diagramming it, more so just memorizing those for familiarity?
Overall, yes, but the only thing I would change there is I wouldn't say to memorize them in a deliberate way. I think this is best done when it happens more organically through exposure to the material. But if you're finding that it just is not sticking with you, what the indicator words mean, then I would take that step of actually doing flashcards.
Got it. Okay. Thanks for your advice and appreciate the videos. Keep pushing them. They're amazing.
Of course, thanks, I will.
Okay, so our next question is from Gagan on test anxiety and when to start taking time tests. Gagan, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, Steve. I'm currently studying for the LSAT, planning on taking it in August. So me, as well as some other people I know, get test anxiety while taking standardized testing and it being timed, or even while studying for the LSAT, because it's a big part of your future. So what do you recommend for that?
It's a great question. It's one I get a lot, and it's incredibly important. And a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that law schools, at least those in the US, they do not average multiple LSAT scores. They only take the highest. They may see all scores. They may, quote unquote, consider all scores. And I think they say that simply because it sounds more holistic. But in reality, they only have incentive to actually consider in calculating your chances with their admissions index, your highest score. And so what that means is that while the LSAT as a whole is incredibly important, no one particular test date will make or break you. You can always retake. And now the LSAT's offered nearly every month. And so it's not all riding on any one particular test date. That's the first thing I would say. The second is that there are strategies that you can use to address test anxiety and test day nerves. One of them, and this applies whether you're taking the LSAT or you're thinking about law school exams in the fall, is simulate test day conditions as closely as possible and do dry runs of the exam, do practice tests, and do them in the same environment where you'll do the actual thing ideally. And because of stay at home and school being online potentially, you're taking exams at your desk with your same computer. And so you can simulate that very closely. And for the LSAT, they actually put the majority of exams in the digital LSAT format, which is the same as the LSAT Flex format. It's called Law Hub, and it's also known as Official LSAT Prep Plus. So at lawhub.lsac.org, you can purchase access to over 60 exams in the digital LSAT format. And so taking exams in that format, you can get a better sense of what the actual flow will be like, because the books aren't doing it justice to replicate it as closely as possible. So do exams in the exact same format with the exact same device in the exact same environment. So if you're doing exams at home in your bedroom with your desk, clear off your desk, make it a comfortable environment to work at so you can do all your studying there rather than at a different table in a different room. With the Flex online, you also want to deal with any of the tech things in advance, like having a good internet connection, running all the appropriate updates on your computer with the software so that you're ready to go on the actual exam when it starts. And for the LSAT Flex, ProctorU actually has a service where you can meet with a live rep and chat with them to work out any tech issues in advance. So if you go to testitout.proctoru.com, test it out with hyphens in between the words, .proctoru.com, you can test out your system in advance, and you can even chat with a rep live who can look at your computer settings and set up everything in advance so that when you start on test day, you're not wasting time figuring it out and getting stressed that things aren't working properly. So the more prep you do in advance, the lower your anxiety level will be, hopefully, because you know that you have more things figured out. And the last thing I'll say, which is almost cliche, but it's true, is mindfulness meditation really can help out a lot. So even just 5 minutes a day over the course of a few weeks or a few months, it would have an impact. And if you don't want to think of it as meditation, you could think of it as focused training, where you're really training yourself to notice when your mind is wandering and you're bringing it back to the task at hand. Obviously, we're all going to fail. Our minds are all going to wander, but the moments where you notice and bring it back, that's where you actually strengthen your self-control like a muscle to notice when your mind wanders. And this has really benefited me personally. I've been doing this for years, and it helps with both staying in the moment while you're on a tough LR problem or just in general.
So our next question is from Adsir on the reading comprehension section. Adsir, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you. Hi, Steve. I took the LSAT this February, but I didn't get the score I wanted. One of the sections I struggled with was the reading comprehension section, because I usually had to reread the passages at least twice. So my question is, how do you quickly retain and absorb the information from the passage you just read, and what are your note-taking methods during the exam? Because I ran out of time during the last two passage questions.
Yeah, sure. Great question. So the first thing I would say is don't try to get everything down if it's not working for you. Don't get bogged down in the details. Simply walk away with the main idea. As an exercise, you could do several passages where all you do is read the passage and then separately write down the main idea. And then check your articulation of the main idea against LSAC's articulation in the questions, because there will be a primary purpose or main idea question. And so see how their wording matches up with yours, and if you truly got what the main idea was. The details, you can always go back for them later, but I wouldn't be taking tons of notes on them or even trying to fully digest all the details in the moment. As for note-taking method, like I said before, I recommend marking very minimally or not at all. And you can't mark on the passage anyway, so you're taking notes to decide on your scratch paper. Simply note, what's the main idea? What's the author's opinion? If you want to do a little bit more, you could also maybe summarize each paragraph with a couple words, but that's it. That's all I would do.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you so much.
Sure, of course.
So right now we have a couple of questions that are similar, so I'm just going to combine them. People are asking about what advice you have on LSAT preparation for different stages of college. So when you're a freshman, sophomore, junior, and so on, like what kind of preparation should you be doing towards the LSAT, and how much time should you be spending working on the LSAT during those various years of college?
Yeah, sure. So I would say for freshman and sophomore, I wouldn't be looking to do a whole lot, if anything. Enjoy college and focus on keeping your GPA up while socializing, current situation aside. Then juniors and seniors, I would start to take it more seriously, especially seniors and ideally juniors. If you could knock it out in the summer between junior and senior year and study for it spring semester junior year, that would be great to have it out of the way and done, especially if you want to go directly from undergrad to law school. But you certainly don't have to do that. But I would say later in college, when you take it more seriously, ideally study for it over the summer and maybe during a semester as well, where you're taking a lighter course load. So I would aim to treat the LSAT like a 6-credit class at least, which if you think about it is actually underemphasizing it because the LSAT weighs more heavily in admissions than your GPA does. But it's one exam on maybe 1 or 2 days if you retake it. So it's worth a lot of effort. So I recommend actually spending 5 to 6 months to reach your fullest potential. Don't just try to study for it in 2 to 3 months and knock it out. It's worth more time than that and takes more time than that to reach your ultimate fullest potential. So 6-credit class during the semester, and then ideally over the summer, you could do it full time with few obligations. Obviously, that's not realistic for most people, but if you can do that, that would be great. So maybe take a light internship or a part-time job over the summer and spend the rest of your time on LSAT prep.
Thank you so much for answering that, Steve. One more question that I have is how many times do you think someone can retake the LSAT without law schools looking upon it unfavorably?
On average, I would say 3 or 4. Beyond 3 or 4 starts to look like maybe you're not exercising the best judgment when deciding whether to take it or not. But one thing I'll add is that you can always postpone or withdraw your LSAT registration, and law schools will never even know that you were signed up for that test. The other thing I'll say is that there are some caveats here, like during these times, especially with the digital LSAT rollout last year and the LSAT Flex now, admission officers will be a little bit more loose and casual regarding the number of takes. They'll be understanding that this is a unique time with new testing formats with the digital on tablet and the Flex now. And so if you took one of those, they will give you a special amount of leeway for that specifically. And if you're taking it 5 or 6 times, you know what? That's okay too. Plenty of people have and still gotten into their dream schools. Simply write an addendum explaining that certain test dates didn't go well for whatever reason, or like the flex or the digital, or there was a proctoring issue of some kind. Things happen and they understand.
Okay, and now Habby has a question on the amount of years after undergrad you should take the LSAT. Habby, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, Steve. Thank you so much for your presentation. I just wanted to ask, what amount of years after undergrad does it kind of look, I don't know, like bad to law schools to take the LSAT, or does it like really not matter? Because what about like someone wanting to go straight from undergrad to like doing a clerkship or like a paralegal position, as opposed to going straight to law school? Like, how would that look?
Yeah, good question. The answer is good news for you, really. It doesn't matter in the slightest. There are plenty of non-traditional applicants, both young professionals as well as folks who are much older. I hear from people in their 50s and 60s and beyond who are taking the LSAT and applying to law school. It might be tougher the older you get if you're out of the zone of studying, if you haven't been doing anything of this nature for a while. So that you may want to allow extra time as more time, as time goes on from undergrad or from a graduate level program, what have you. But law schools don't care. And in fact, having work experience can help your application. It's not required, but it's certainly a nice thing to have. What I would think more about is what will best set you up for success on the LSAT, and what extra time might you need to allow if you're not in the flow of studying for an exam like this. And so just give yourself more time and be patient with yourself if that's your situation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
So our next question is from Anushka on the implications of this pandemic on the LSAT. Anushka, you can unmute yourself, please.
Hi, I had another question. So how do you think law schools will kind of like interpret our LSAT scores like based on like the pandemic right now? So if someone, for example, does worse because they couldn't have like they couldn't afford like proper preparations, or they did extra well despite the fact that they were like struggling financially or something like that. So how do you think like law schools would interpret those scores?
Ultimately, the number is the number. So if during a pandemic you can't reach your fullest potential on the LSAT, the best thing you could do is retake. That's my suggestion, is that retake the LSAT during a time when you will be able to give it your all. And if that means delaying law school a year, that obviously isn't what you want to do most likely, but if that's what you got to do, that's what you got to do.
Thank you.
Of course. One thing I could add to this is the admission side of things, which is that law schools treat flex scores the same as regular scores. They're out of 120 to 180. But in terms of competitiveness, that remains to be seen. So it's an open question. I mean, for those starting law school this fall or who are getting off the wait list, it may be less competitive if folks decide not to go. And then those applying this fall for next year, it might be more competitive because applications typically increase during economic difficulties or economic uncertainty as folks look to wait out a recession for 3 years. So next cycle might be more competitive. We'll see. But law schools, when it comes to the numbers, they just want the numbers at the end of the day.
Thank you.
Sure.
So Adsar has a question on the minimum LSAT score for scholarships.
Yeah, I have another question. So what is the score you estimate to be the minimum you can get a large amount of money so we don't have to take student loans? And a follow-up for that is, how many of your fellow law school classmates had a low LSAT score but a high GPA? Because I'm in that position right now.
Sure, that's a good question. So first thing I'll say is I didn't go to law school. I actually didn't go to law school myself. I got sidetracked with the LSAT, never made it, got obsessed with this exam, fascinated by it. So I never personally went. But there are plenty of people who have low GPAs and high LSAT scores, or vice versa. There are splitters, there are reverse splitters. Law schools look at the numbers and make their own calculations about that. As for scholarships, if your LSAT score is above the median, that's what means you're more likely to get scholarship money, because you would boost their average LSAT score and help them rise in the rankings. So it's school to school, it varies. Typically getting a couple points above their median can help you boost your odds of getting scholarship money. And that's part of why retaking is so valuable, since law schools don't average scores, they take the highest.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you so much.
Sure, of course.
Some of our students are actually wondering if you can go more in depth into some LSAT terms that have been used, such as splitters, and even how to register for the LSAT, because you have to go through the LSAC to do so.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And so splitters are basically those with high LSAT scores and low GPs. I think that's what it is, actually. It could be the reverse. But basically, splitters and reverse splitters are when you have a significant difference between the standardized test score and your undergraduate GPA. And so some folks will have lower GPAs and significantly higher LSATs where their GPA doesn't reflect their true potential. Others have the reverse. And then the other question, remind me?
The other question was the sort of the registration process for the LSAT, because you have to go through the LSAC to do so.
Yeah, sure. So basically, go on LSAC's site, lsac.org, and you can sign up for future LSAT dates. At the moment, the only LSAT you can register for is the July LSAT. They haven't yet opened registration for the August LSAT or beyond. Usually they would have by now, but I think because of the pandemic and the LSAT Flex confusion and everything they've been dealing with there, they haven't had a chance to deal with that yet, or they want to hold off and wait to see whether they're going to deliver it in person or online. But that would be the place to do it.
Thank you. Olivia has a question about extra test accommodations. Olivia, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, yeah, so I noticed that the SAT and ACT offer test accommodations such as extra time. I was wondering if the LSAT, if this applies to the LSAT as well, and if so, like what does the application process look like?
Yeah, they do. They do offer accommodations, including extra time. And they used to be a lot more stringent about that, but overly stringent, actually. And then they got sued a number of times. And since then, they no longer mark scores of those who got extra time with an asterisk. So law schools will never know whether you got extra time or not. And then the process is simply apply to LSAC far in advance with all the appropriate documentation. And so typically an evaluation from a doctor. And if you have a previous history of receiving accommodations from undergrad or from the College Board, that would certainly help your case as well. But if you can provide that kind of documentation and you do so early enough for a particular test date, you will probably get it. And typically, those with extra time get either time and a half or double time. Time and a half would be, rather than 35 minutes per section, you get 53 minutes per section. And double time would be 70 minutes rather than 35 minutes. And you may also get extra breaks depending on what your accommodations are. There are also accommodations that are not extra time for those with some sort of visual impairment or other physical disabilities. So that would be something to look into too, depending on what your needs are.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
Our next question is from Jasmine on fee waivers. Jasmine, you can unmute yourself.
Hi. So when I took the ACT and SAT, I was offered fee waivers because I could not afford the test fees. And so I was wondering if the LSAT does something similar. Like, do they discount a price for students who cannot afford the fees?
Yeah, they do. So they actually offer fee waivers, and you apply with typically tax returns from the previous year. And the fee waiver can include things like getting multiple LSATs for free. So you could actually take the LSAT for free, which is saving you $200 for each administration. They also recently changed, so you get a year-long subscription to the official LSAT Prep Plus with the digital LSATs. You get a year access of that for free as well as some other things related to the law school application process, like sending over reports to law schools. And so if you think you might qualify, definitely get in touch with them over that, provide all the documentation, and again, do it far in advance.
Thank you.
So our next question is from Jasleen on prep courses. Jasleen, you can unmute yourself.
Steve, so I was wondering, there's plenty of prep courses out there. Do you recommend us to take one? And if not, do you recommend us to just prep by our own, or should we purchase a prep course and use that?
It's really whatever works best for you, whatever you think you need. Obviously, you can go it alone with self-study. Many folks do. I've put together a lot of resources for those who are looking to self-study, including day-by-day LSAT study plans. And so folks interested could look those up. They're on the LSAT blog. I also have my own courses as well that include live online classes and Q&As. They also include group coaching, which is something unique I haven't seen anywhere else. And especially during the pandemic time when everyone's stuck at home, obviously live online is the way to go. And so I also offer on-demand video lessons as well as part of the courses at different levels. So you could choose only the on-demand videos. You could choose on-demand videos and live classes, or you could choose the option including the group coaching as well. And so I'll see if I could put a link to that in the chat as well for those interested. As for the question, though, of what to do, it really depends on your learning style. Some folks like books, some folks like videos, some folks like live classes. It's really whatever fits your preferences. And so I'd say definitely look at samples first to see if you like the style, but getting more support certainly couldn't hurt. Just a question of your budget.
Thank you, Steve.
Of course.
So our next question is from Mark. Mark, you can unmute yourself. Mark? Okay, I'll just ask his question, I guess.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, you're here. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, sorry about that. I was just wondering, like, what would be the best way to study for the LSAT if we are doing it by ourselves? And I know you already like talked about video on demand and stuff like that, but is there have you noticed like a trend on the best ways to do it if you are doing it without the prep course or without the books or something like that?
Yeah, sure. So if you're doing it without a prep course, I would say you want to focus a lot on the actual official LSAT prep tests, which you can get in books or as part of the official LSAT Prep Plus online from LSAC. I would start with those for sure. Use those. On top of that, there's plenty of free resources out there. I've got the LSAT blog, the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. I've got a Facebook group and Instagram putting out tons of free information. LSAC has also partnered with the Khan Academy, and so you can get more free exams from there. I don't think the methods or the lessons there are necessarily the best, but it's free. So if you have more time than money, you could navigate through that. The study plans I have would be my recommendations without a prep course. So the study plans follow that laser approach I mentioned. So learning the theory, doing individual questions by type, then full sections, then full exams. I have paid ones, but I also have free week by week ones to give you a sample of what it could be like. So I'll put a link to that as well. And basically just laying out for all different periods of time how to best use the exams in conjunction with free resources. And so that way you're doing things systematically, not just doing exam after exam and falling into that trap.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
So one question that I actually had was that you've obviously provided some great resources for students to use as well as schedules, but sometimes it's easy to get caught up in like the whole, excitement of everyone is taking the LSAT at the same time as you and it's nearing, and then some people get, too occupied with that and study for days at a time. So how would you suggest avoiding that and like really pacing yourself better so that you're better equipped to take the test and you're not just overloading and like crashing right before the exam?
Yeah. Burnout is real. Burnout is real, especially if you have too much free time on your hands to study for this exam. So I would say take days off. Take days off. I build them into my study plans for a reason. Some people need the momentum of doing something every single day though, but if you aren't going to take days off, keep it extremely minimal, like just one question to help you keep that momentum going. But beyond that, I wouldn't do too much. I would also set limits where like you're budgeting time not only by weeks or months, but by what's happening over the course of a day. So within a single day, when are you taking a break for lunch? When are you starting? And when are you stopping? And I have links for that as well. I could send out after. I don't want to put too many links in the chat at once, but basically the idea is that you wake up, you eat breakfast, you work out, study for a few hours, break for lunch, study a few more hours, and you're done. So max maybe 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the afternoon. That's 6 hours. That's more than enough. You could do 2 and 2 or 2.5 and 2.5, but basically not making it be 8-10 hours a day and setting a goal where after a certain point, like after 5 p.m. or after 4 p.m., you're done with LSAT for the day and you can just relax.
Thank you so much, Steve. And also, everyone, I recommend saving the links that Steve has been sending into the chat. Our next question is from Ariel regarding academic dishonesty.
Hey, Steve. So I know you have the opportunity to connect with a lot of admissions counselors, and I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on what you think their views are on an academic dishonesty case during your undergrad. I know many of them say they are forgiving, but I would like to know to what extent do you think that's actually true? And secondly, more so on the disclosure process. I know that, rehabilitation is something to include, but anything more specific that you think are good things to include in that disclosure process?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the first thing I'll say is law schools take character and fitness very seriously, and you should as well, because when you go before the bar after you finish law school, they will look into your history. They can do all kinds of searches on you. And if you did not disclose something that you should have, that could potentially get you barred from entering the bar, from being admitted. So you want to err on the side of disclosure up front now with the law school admissions process. Now, you asked about academic dishonesty. They actually take that extremely seriously because that's an ethical issue. And lawyers, of course, are dealing with ethical things in their professional capacities. So law schools will be concerned about cases of academic dishonesty. And so while you have to disclose it, it could hurt your chances maybe a little bit, depending on how you do it. You want to be very much upfront. You want to take responsibility for what happened, show that you understand the gravity of what happened and that nothing like it will ever happen again. Now, you mentioned rehabilitation as well. Can you share more on that?
Yeah, just like I guess steps of saying like what steps you've taken to kind of make that situation not happen again and what you've done to become a better person from the situation. But the thing that I've been kind of concluding is the decision I've kind of been conflicted on is, do I not disclose up front and kind of deal with it on the back end with the bar and, hope that I'd be able to get into a good law school on the front end, but get postponed admission into the bar 6 months to a year? Or do I disclose up front, risking the chances of not getting into a good law school, but knowing for certainty that I'll be admitted into wherever I'd like to practice law?
I would say disclose up front. You don't want to take any chances. You want to be as upfront as possible, but also look at the specifics of the question. It's possible there are some things that you don't need to disclose, but in something like academic dishonesty, my guess is that you would certainly need to. I can't imagine a case where you wouldn't need to. You have things like being arrested versus being convicted, where like maybe some questions say convicted, others say arrested. In those cases, you may or may not need to. But academic dishonesty, if there's any record of anything, you'll probably want to disclose. And if it's so minor that you're not even sure whether you need to, then it probably won't hurt you that much to just err on the side of disclosing. And the risk reward ratio here, I think, definitely leans heavily into disclosing. If there's a question whether you could run into a problem 3 years from now, I'd say avoid that stress hanging over you for 3 years and potentially wasting all that time and money in law school, and just get it out there now and work on the wording, work on what you've done. As for the question of what have you done to show you've rehabilitated, I can't answer that for you. It's up to what you actually do.
All right. Okay, cool. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much, Steve. Our next question is from Gagan on extended time.
Hi. So I know you explained a little bit about extended time, but I guess in what sort of situations would you be approved for extended time? If it didn't have to do with something like visual impairment or things like that.
Yeah, it's typically for things like ADHD or ADD. That's when I typically hear about it coming up. But typically a doctor, medical professional can do an evaluation. And for things like difficulty focusing, it may qualify. That's where I hear it mentioned most often.
And also, if you could just take a minute to discuss, I guess, mental health and test-taking strategies, because I know with everyone being home during this time, not everyone's family situations may be ideal while they're studying and they can't get that proper environment. So what do you recommend for that?
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. I guess I would say set yourself up as much as you can to get the studying done that you're able to, but also be compassionate with yourself and recognize that you may not be able to do as much as you would have under ordinary circumstances. If you live with other people, you've got to consider their needs too, and they've got to consider your needs. But there may be only so much one can do, especially if you're living in a smaller house with more people in there, or more noise or responsibilities that come up. Those could all take a toll on your LSAT prep. So I wouldn't try to do the ideal under a less than ideal situation. Like if my ideal plan involves 6 hours a day, but you can only do 2 hours a day, that's fine. Maybe you won't take the LSAT in July or August. You'll push it back to the fall. And hopefully quarantine's lifted by then and things are back to normal. We'll see what happens. But you might want to delay your LSAT journey as a result of this pandemic. And that's totally reasonable. I just wouldn't try to do everything you would under ordinary circumstances.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Our next question is from Harshita on the importance of the writing component.
Hi, Steve. My question for you is that how important is the LSAT writing component? I've heard from some of my peers that it's not weighed equally or it's not as important. And is that really so?
Yeah, great question. It's true. It's not as important. It's not as weighted as equally, in part because it's not scored. So there's no numerical component there, and law school admissions is largely numerical with those objective numbers there. But the writing sample actually matters a little bit more than it used to because it's now online and typed rather than handwritten. So law school admission officers can actually read what you wrote. So they're more likely to look at it. They give a special attention to it in cases where you're applying as a non-native English speaker or your English-related grades in college were low. They want to look to see what is your writing truly like. The writing sample shows that because it's timed and they know it was you doing it, not like your personal statement where you could have gotten help in editing. So I wouldn't inordinately stress about it compared to the scored portions of the LSAT. And also because you're not doing it on the same day as the actual scored LSAT, you have time. You could take the LSAT and take the writing sample a week later when you're fresh and ready to go. And you could do a few practice versions if you want to. People don't typically, but you could at least take it when you're fresh and in the ideal environment for it, not like it used to be where the LSAT was paper and you were doing it after doing 5 LSAT sections when your brain was fried by the end. This is a better chance for you to show your full potential in writing.
All right, thanks. I have one more question for you. I was wondering if LSAT in any way indicates how well you're going to do in law school or how much of a metal you have to be a lawyer, or is it just a standalone factor to get admission into a law school?
That's a good question. It's somewhere in the middle. I'd say the LSAT does have a demonstrated correlation with first-year law school grades, which in turn are related to bar passage rates. It doesn't indicate what you're going to be as a lawyer. That's a totally separate thing. There's people skills, there's networking, there's ability to generate business, ability to perform in a courtroom that could all relate to success as a lawyer, but have nothing to do with the LSAT. But the LSAT, the skills that it tests, like critical reasoning, deductive reasoning, navigating dense text, those, to me at least, quite clearly relate to what you do as a law student in law school itself. So I would say there's some relationship there, but it doesn't define you, certainly. And the fact that you can improve significantly means that your starting point doesn't reflect where you'll ultimately end up.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Well, those are all of our questions for today. Thank you so much, Steve, for being here and for answering all of our students' questions, and genuinely just for the amazing advice you've given as well as the resources you've provided. Everyone, thank you so much for attending. Make sure you save the links in the chat that Steve has sent in. And yeah, thank you so much for being here. We loved having you, and thank you to everyone who attended.
Thank you for all the great questions, and thank you everyone for joining. It was a pleasure.
Thank you,
Steve.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.